And joining us now is the Consul General to New York from Israel, Ambassador Ido Aharoni. Ambassador, great to have you here.
Thank you for having me, Rita.
Wonderful to have you here, and such a fascinating and important time, I think, about in America. What's your reaction, especially to some of the latest terrorist attacks that we've seen here on U.S. soil?
Well, our position is well known. We've been saying all along that what we need to do, the entire international community, is to address the root cause of the problem, and that is the growing wave of radicalism. We see it in the Middle East, we see it in Europe, and unfortunately, we see more and more of it here in North America.
Do you believe that we will see another attack? I know there have been many recent comments by the head of the NYPD, Bill Bratton, where he has said it's not really a question of if there will be another attack, but when.
I know that NYPD is considered the best in the world in what they do, and I'm sure that they're preparing for all eventuality. I can tell you that the mindset of us back home in Israel is that terrorism, unfortunately and sadly, is part of our lives, and we have to protect ourselves all the time. And so we are preparing across the board, whether it's a nursery school, whether it's a shopping mall, whether it's a movie theater, whether it's a basketball arena. We're always expecting the worst, and unfortunately, it's part of life in Israel.
Do you think, to your point, that we can learn a lot from Israel because you guys have gone through this, as I've seen firsthand over there?
Well, it's a process of learning from each other. We're learning from the Europeans are learning from us, we're learning from the Americans are learning from us. I think that one thing that happened as a result of the rising wave of instability in the Middle East is that governments across the board are talking to each other, and you see new alliances and new cooperations are being formed, and I think it's a good thing.
How much cooperation, to your point, Ambassador, is there between, especially I would think, between New York and between Israel?
A great deal of cooperation. I can tell you, in addition to, in my years of service in New York, I took part in 4 mayoral visits and 2 gubernatorial visits, and countless visits of other New York officials, not to mention the tens, if not hundreds, of Israeli officials that came to New York during my years of service here. So the cooperation is deeper and wider than ever.
How much more complex is it, especially with social media? Have you seen that also over in your country? And certainly we have seen the influence of it over here.
The biggest challenge is to collect information. How do you collect information when there is no organization behind the attack? How do you collect information when you have the lone gunman scenario? When the attacks are 100% random, when people are inspired or incited to violence through social media, very, very difficult to intercept. And then again, I think that we all owe a huge debt of gratitude to law enforcement in the United States and here in New York for protecting us so effectively.
What are your thoughts about racial profiling, or at least, some sort of profiling?
Well, I'd rather not use that term because it's so politically controversial. What we do is trying to address motivation. When you look at the philosophy behind anti-terrorism or counter-terrorism, there are 3 components that one needs to bring into consideration: the motivation of your opponent, the military capabilities of your opponent, and the opportunities that your opponent has to strike. And each country, each culture has a different philosophy. We in Israel believe that when you look at that triangle, we need to put all of our efforts in identifying the motivation first. It's important to identify the weapons, the capabilities. It's important to block the opportunities. But the most important thing that we need to do in Israel, that's what we do. We try to address the motivation. By the way, this was the dispute between us and the international community around the issue of Iran's nuclear program. We said, okay, blocking the path to one bomb is important and it's good, but let's address the motivation of this regime. After all, the problem with this current regime in Iran is what they stand for, what they believe in, not necessarily what they do.
When you talk about motivational profiling, is there some sort of profiling that is significant? I mean, I took El Al, and I remember, just the incredible screening that goes through on that airline, of course, the Israeli airline. Is there some merit to some sort of profiling?
We don't have the luxury of taking risks. This is one thing that we learned. We are a very small nation surrounded by enemies. We've been through all of that, airplane hijacking, elementary school attacks. I remember when I was a kid, one of my biggest fears in Israel was that my school will be attacked by terrorists. That's what happened to us many times with Palestinian terrorism in the 60s and the 70s. And so we don't really have the luxury of taking any risks whatsoever. So we do whatever it takes to protect ourselves.
Do you believe that there is some sort of criteria that should be looked at, whether it's motivational or some sort of, okay, wait a minute, here, and here?
Well, without going into detail as to the methodology of intelligence organizations, but I think that intelligence organizations today, especially in the age of social media, are in a position to know a lot more about potential threats.
And do whatever it takes, essentially, whether if somebody fits a criteria or not.
Well, that's exactly what I think the goal is for every law enforcement, is to make sure that you minimize to zero the loss of innocent lives. And I think that even in situations of combat, there are certain rules. And I say that as someone who experienced combat during the first Lebanon War from 1982 to 1984.
What about the issue of walls? Because even Donald Trump in our presidential race certainly has talked about a wall. We have, of course, he's even referred to the wall in Israel.
Well, the reason for us to create a barrier, the walled section of the 745-kilometer-long barrier is only 4%. So in our case, it's actually a security fence. And the purpose of this fence was to prevent suicide bombers from infiltrating Israel, because between the years 2000 to 2005, we had to endure no less than 550 attempts to carry out suicide bombing attacks, out of which 144 were quote-unquote successful, inflicting 63% of the loss in life. In other words, suicide bombing attacks became the one single most lethal threat to innocent Israelis. We lost 1,400 people in 5 years of violence inflicted on us by the Palestinians. So the Israeli government made a decision to erect a barrier. It's a very sophisticated, high-tech security fence. And I have to say, in the places where the fence is operational, much of the interface between Israel and the West Bank, the penetration ratio, the infiltration ratio of the terrorists dropped down to zero.
So the wall is working, you feel, in those areas?
The security fence is extremely effective in those areas.
And there's word that it's getting a little bit bigger. Is there a reason why?
The wall is getting bigger. No, the wall is the walled section is a tiny portion of the barrier. The vast majority of the barrier, 96% of the barrier, is a high-tech security fence equipped with cameras and sensors and so on.
Are there things that we can learn from you? Because as to your point, you guys have lived through this, and sadly it has been on the rise, attacks clearly around the country and especially here in the United States. What are some of the lessons you think we can learn from Israel?
Well, I don't think it's for me to brag about the achievements of my own country. I think that both Israel and the United States find themselves today in the same boat. We are on the same side of this issue, and the issue is how to provide our citizens with maximum security. And we're working together with the government of the United States. We're working together with other governments in the West in order to make sure, because the level of physical mobility today in the world, and I'm not just talking about social media that can allow us to communicate with people from other different continents, but the level of physical mobility today in the world is such that there's a big portion of the people that live in the world today that we consider citizens of the world. These are people that travel all the time for business, for leisure, it doesn't matter. But, we need to protect them. We need to protect them when they're on the air. We need to protect them when they're on the ground.
Ambassador, the sad news is you are leaving us. You have been in the diplomatic circles for many, many years. I've had the pleasure of knowing you in a whole bunch of different roles that you've played here in New York and in the United States. What are you doing and when are you leaving us?
Well, my last day on the job is going to be in mid-July, and after 25 years of service in the government, it's time for me to move on. And I'm leaving New York. This is my second term in New York. We actually met during my first term between 2001 and 2005. If you remember, I came shortly before 9/11, about 2.5 months before 9/11, and the day of 9/11, you contacted me, and that was the beginning of our friendship.
It's when everything bloomed, the great friendship bloomed. And by the way, what an important day too of all days, because you, as you point out, you just assumed that position a few weeks before that. What was that like?
Well, we realized that something happened of biblical proportions, and we realized then, as we realize today, that the world will never be the same. And I think that since 9/11, we all changed the way we live, we all changed the way we travel, we all changed the way we think. And this was imposed on us, this was forced on us by a very, very dangerous enemy. And this enemy is targeting our entire civilization. It's not a certain policy, it's not a certain political party, it's not a certain political leader. They are targeting what we represent. It's not what we do, it's what we stand for that bothers them.
And, after all that, you also were appointed to serve as the head of Israel's brand management team in Jerusalem. You've worn many hats. What was that like?
Well, that was the best job I've ever had in my whole life. This was an opportunity given to a person once in a lifetime to try and improve the positioning of your country by implementing a series of strategies. And in our case, it was by highlighting Israel's relative advantages. In economy, they teach us to maximize our competitive edge. And this is something that we really in Israel failed to do because we were too preoccupied managing crisis. And we forgot that there's also another dimension to Israel. Israel is making a wonderful contribution to the quality of life of every person on the face of this earth day in and day out. Let us celebrate that. And with the help of our great friends in the organized Jewish world, with the help of our great friends in the Christian world, with the help of our great friends in many other institutions, in academics, we started a long-term celebration, strategic celebration of Israel as a hub of creativity. This is something that we conceived here shortly after 9/11 in 2002, 2003. It was all based on research. The research was provided to us by many sources. One of them was the BAV, the Brand Asset Valuator by Young and Rubicam. Another was by BIG, the Brand Israel Group. Other studies were conducted by the Israeli government directly. And when I became the head of the brand management team in 2007, we started implementing those strategies. And the results are phenomenal, I have to say.
Do you think sometimes, to your point, that sort of the beauty of Israel, it's a great country, and I've been over there, and there is so much growth and so many other things, but that it often does get overshadowed by these terrorist attacks and by what we're seeing in the violence in the Mideast?
That's true, and the rationale, the philosophy behind it actually has two elements. The first is the realization that in today's world, today's world is characterized by this vicious, almost competition between places, and the competition is over the attention of the consumer. So the first assumption is that in today's world, it's important to be right, and we believe we are right, but it is no less important to be attractive. And the second realization is that no place in the world, no human being, no organization, no institution is interested in being defined by its problems only. And Israel is no exception. Just as New York did not want to be defined by its problems in the 70s, Israel doesn't want to be defined to the world by its problems today. And we need to work very hard to broaden the conversation about Israel.
And by the way, you've always been, I think, such a great articulate spokesman for your country. You've just, I think, been such a phenomenal representative. And no surprise, by the way, I didn't know this, and I've known you for a number of years. I didn't realize that you went to Emerson College for mass communications. You also, of course, went to Tel Aviv University, and you got a major in film and television. So you were well geared to, presenting a good message on top of being obviously very knowledgeable as well.
That's true. I had a short career in journalism before I sold out and moved to
You could have been my co-host, Do you realize that?
Oh, I'd love that.
Also, you were in foreign service, which I think, of course, is mandatory. It's required there in Israel, but you were serving in the Israeli Defense Forces as a company commander. How important was that time shaping you? And what do you think that does also to, I think, just the patriotism that a lot of people feel in Israel?
In Israel, the Israel Defense Forces is the number one social integrator. I served in the Army from 80 to 84, 4 years, because I also was an officer in the infantry.
During the Lebanon War, by the way.
And the Lebanon War broke out in the middle of my military service in 1982, and then you become a reservist, which also keeps you in the loop. So I served in reserves until the age of 48. Not all the years in infantry. I served in infantry until my late 30s, and then I moved to a different job. But you continue to serve your nation until the military tells you go home. You're too old for us. But it was a privilege to serve my country in the Army, and I have to say, as a young man who cared only about basketball and girls, the military service really turned me into the person I am today. I learned discipline in the Army. I learned organization in the Army. I learned how to work with team members, and I really believe that those 4 years turned me into the person I am today.
Yeah, how important do you think that is, too? Because also as a diplomat, and everybody, we are talking to Ambassador Ido Aharoni, Consul General of Israel here in New York, who's sadly going to be leaving us soon after many, many great years representing his country and being a great bridge, I think, between Israel and America. How important is that, too, to have that experience? I feel like when you're going out there and you're speaking on shows like mine and so many others about what's happening, the complexities of whether it's Iran or something happening in Israel, to have been there on the front lines in battle. Don't you think that also added such an important layer and such an important sense of connection?
No question about it. I have to say that for my Israeli peers, it's not an exceptional thing. Most of my friends served with me in Lebanon. I'm talking about my peer group, and others served in other capacities. My brother went to the Army in 1973, and I know almost every Israeli that I know has a military chapter in his or her life. I even met my wife in the military, and it does serve as the glue that keeps us together. Until this very day, the IDF, the Israel Defense Forces, it is at the very center of Israeli social and cultural life.
Well, as you talk about meeting your wife is also a native of Los Angeles. I know you have 3 kids now. What is ahead for you? What's next for you, Ambassador?
Well, I'm going to retire from government, but not retire from work. I will be combining academics and business.
By the way, I don't ever see you totally retiring. You are a workhorse. I can't ever imagine your version of retiring is 60 to 80 hours a week.
Thank you. Well, I hope that in my new life I will find the same level of interest and intensity that I had working for the Israeli government.
And will you be back and forth, or what's sort of the next phase? And are you looking forward to this?
Certainly, I am looking forward to going back to Israel. We will be back in our home, which is in the beautiful community of the Radar Hill outside of Jerusalem, overlooking the coastal plain. We live in a beautiful mountain community. My son, my youngest, will be going into the military. So it will be a good thing for us to be around him when he's in the military for the next few years. And we have a daughter who lives in Jerusalem right now. She's a student, and she's working for the Jerusalem Post. And we have another daughter who lives in New York. She's an attorney, and she works in media, just like yourself. And we are looking forward. It's a new and exciting chapter in our lives.
Well, we wish you so much luck. You've had a really amazing career, an amazing life, and again, I think have been just a tremendous, tremendous asset to your country and to our country, too, and just such an eloquent and wonderful spokesperson, and also just a great patriot, too, Ambassador. I've had the pleasure of knowing you for years, and you have just done such a phenomenal job, and I think made us all feel a lot closer to Israel and understand Israel beautifully through your eyes. So thank you so much, and look forward to continued friendship and hopefully seeing you in Jerusalem at some point in the future.
Thank you, my dear friend. Thank you so much.